By the spring of 1943, the men of the 10th Panzer Division expected only one thing from the Americans dug into the hills in front of them. They expected that, when pushed hard enough, these men would break. They had reason to believe it. Only weeks before, in the passes to the north, they had watched this same enemy give way and fall back in the dark. So on the morning of the 23rd of March, the panzers came forward with the calm of men who had done this before. The ground they crossed was a dry valley east of a small mud-walled town called Guettar in southern Tunisia. Bare brown hills rose on either side of the road. It was open country, flat and wide, offering nothing to hide behind. And open country was exactly the kind of ground where these crews had never yet lost a fight. But the valley was not quite what it looked. In the night, while the German camp slept, small groups of Americans had been out in that open ground in the dark, bent low, working with their hands. And they had left something behind in the soil. Higher up, in the folds of the hills where no tank commander would think to look, sat a thin line of guns. They had not been placed there to hold a road or defend a wall. They had been placed there to wait. The men behind those guns rode an odd machine. It looked like a tank, but the top of it had been cut away, leaving the turret open to the bare sky. To most soldiers it seemed a thing left half-finished. It was not. It had been built that way on purpose. And the orders those crews carried were stranger than the machine. They were not to charge. They were not to meet the panzers out in the open, gun facing gun, the way one tank is supposed to fight another. They were to stay low, stay hidden, let the German armor come all the way in, close, and then closer still, and hold their fire until the last moment, and then strike, not from the front, but from the side. It went against everything a fighting man feels in his chest. To sit still in a hole in the ground and watch the enemy roll toward you, and do nothing, more than one of them would say, years later, how hard that was. This is the story of one of those crews, one machine, in one fold of one hill, over the space of a single afternoon, and of the gunner who sat behind its 3-inch gun and waited for the order that would not come. We do not know his name. The records kept the number of his battalion and the count of the hulls left burning, but not the small things, not the sweat, not the waiting. Those we have to sit beside him to feel. He had been awake since long before first light. In the dark they had run the machine up into the hills, backing it into a shallow scrape in the slope, piling brush and stone against its flanks until only the gun showed. Then they had shut the engine off. And in the sudden quiet, sitting in the open steel box of the turret, he had listened to the hills breathe, the wind moving over the rock, a bird somewhere, the tick of cooling metal. The sun came up hard. By mid-morning the steel around him was too hot to hold a bare hand against, and the flies had found them. He sat with the flies on his neck and did not move, because movement, up here, was the one thing that could give them away. So he let them crawl, and made a small private game of not moving, a game being easier to bear than the truth of why he could not move. Below and to the north, he had already heard the morning. It had started before the light, the grinding of tracks, the flat crack of guns carrying up the valley, the deep answering thud of the German armor coming on. That first blow had fallen on other men. Machines lower and thinner skinned than his, caught out where the ground gave them nowhere to hide. He had heard how that went. He tried not to think about it now. The morning attack had been stopped in the end, and the valley had gone quiet again. But quiet, here, did not mean over. It meant they were coming back. Everyone in the hills knew it, the way you know a storm is still in the air after the first roll of thunder has moved off. The only question was when. So he waited through the worst part of the day, the long white afternoon, with the sun straight overhead and the valley shimmering below him, and nothing to do but hold still and watch the empty road. The commander stood beside him in the open turret, field glasses to his eyes, saying nothing. The loader sat with his back to the steel, a round already in his arms, turning it slowly in his hands the way a man worries a coin. Nobody spoke. Speaking used up something a man might need later. The gunner put his eye to the sight and, out of habit, laid the thin black lines across the mouth of the valley where the road came in. empty. He lifted his head, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, put his eye back down. The waiting had a way of stretching 1 minute until it felt like an hour, then handing him an hour that felt like nothing at all. It was the middle of the afternoon when the dust came. Not a sound first, a smudge. A pale brown stain rising off the valley floor to the east, where the road bent out of sight behind the low ground. He felt the commander go still beside him, that particular stillness a man has when he has seen a thing and is making very sure of it before he lets himself speak. The field glasses did not move. For a long moment, nobody in the machine said anything at all, and the only sound was the wind and, far off, faint, the first grinding note of engines. Then the commander spoke, low, almost gentle, the way you speak in church. Here they come. He did not need to say it. The gunner had already found the dust in his sight and was watching it thicken. They came out of the low ground the way water finds a channel, first one dark shape, then another behind it, then more, spreading out across the valley floor. Panzers, squat, purposeful, unhurried, the low sun catching the dust on their flanks, coming on exactly as they had that morning, in the same loose spread, with the same terrible patience. The gunner's mouth had gone dry. He was aware of his own heartbeat, of the round in the breech, of the small distance between his hand and the trigger. And he was aware, above all, of the order. Hold. Not yet. Let them come. There is a particular kind of courage that has no motion in it. Not the courage to charge, but the courage to sit still, with your hands off the trigger, while the thing you fear grows larger in your sight. That was the courage the afternoon asked of him. The lead tank was well into the valley now. He could see it clearly. The long gun, the cross on the hull, the dust boiling off the tracks. Every instinct he owned told him to fire. He did not fire. Beside him, the commander watched through the glasses, lips moving, counting, putting a number to the shapes in the dust, the way a man counts cattle or graves. The gunner kept the sight on the lead tank and breathed slow through his mouth. In, out, slow. His father had taught him that once, on a cold grey morning, over a deer he had been too eager to hit, and the lesson had come, of all places, here. And then, out in the valley, the first tank found what the Americans had left in the soil during the night. There was a flash low against the hull, a fountain of earth thrown up, and the flat, hard slap of the sound reaching them a half-second late. He felt it in his chest, before his mind had named it. The tank slewed sideways and stopped, one track unspooled behind it like a dropped belt. For a moment, nothing else moved. The other tanks slowed, hesitating, as men inside them understood that the open ground was not open at all, that the earth itself had been turned against them. And in that hesitation they bunched together, which was exactly the thing the whole long night of digging in the dark had been meant to make them do. Now, the commander's voice was still quiet. The gunner did not remember deciding to fire. He remembered the sight settling on the flank of the nearest tank, the small pressure of his hand, and then the world coming apart. The gun went off like the end of everything. The whole machine rocked back on its springs. A wall of dust and cordite blew up around the open turret and hung there, and his ears folded shut into a high, thin ringing. Through the smoke, he saw the round strike home, a bright, hard spark on the side of the German tank, low, where the armor was thin. A thread of black smoke stood up from it. The tank did not move again. Loader, the word came out of him as a croak, but the round was already going in. He heard the breech clang shut behind him, felt more than heard, the loader's fist strike his shoulder. Up, loaded, go. He was already traversing. The valley below him had turned into a thing he had never seen. Tanks stopped, tanks turning, tanks firing wildly at the hills, searching for an enemy they could not find. Because that enemy was above them and threw up no muzzle flash they could follow through the dust. He found a second tank in his sight, side on, and fired again, and again the machine slammed back, and the dust rose and swallowed the world. His shoulder had begun to ache from the buck of it, a deep bruise forming that he would not feel until tomorrow. When it cleared, the tank was burning, and figures were coming out of it and running low across the open ground. He did not watch them run. Some far part of him registered that they were men and then set the thought down because there was no room to carry it. He was already looking for the next one. Somewhere in the last minute, the fear had gone out of him, not replaced by courage exactly, but by work. There was too much to do to be afraid. This is the thing the histories do not tell you, because it cannot be counted. Not how many tanks, not how many minutes, but how a frightened man, given a task small enough to hold in his two hands, disappears into it and becomes for a while only a pair of eyes and a gun. Traverse. Sight, fire, the loader's fist on his shoulder. Traverse. The rhythm took him, and he lived inside it. The open turret filled again and again with the hot reek of the gun, and spent brass rang on the floor and rolled underfoot, and the loader kicked it aside without once looking down. The Germans had found the range of the hills by now. Rounds began to come back. The air overhead tore, and somewhere down the slope, a shell burst and flung stones that rang off the steel like thrown gravel. The commander had dropped down into the turret. Blood ran from a cut above his ear, where a stone had caught him. But he stayed at the gunner's shoulder, calling targets in the same low voice, wiping the blood out of his eye with the heel of his hand. Left, the one behind the wrecked one. See him? The gunner swung the gun. He saw him. A tank, nosing up behind the first burning hull, using it for cover, its own gun swinging up toward the hills, toward them. For one bad second, the two guns were hunting each other across the same stretch of dust, the German feeling for the hillside, the gunner settling his lines on the German's flank. It was a question of who steadied first. He steadied first. The gun went off. When the dust tore away, the German tank was slewed sideways, and still, its own gun pointing off harmlessly at the empty sky, and he let out a breath he had not known he was holding. Down the slope, one of the other machines was not so lucky. He caught it at the edge of his eye, a flat orange flash, a machine like his own, lifting slightly and settling wrong, and then the black smoke starting. He looked away. It was not coldness, it was the opposite. If he let himself look, he would not be able to keep working, and the working was the only thing that might still save the rest of them. The loader was moving like a machine himself now, faster than thought, the rounds going up in one long, unbroken chain. His hands were bleeding from the sharp edges of the racks, and he had not noticed, and would not, until it was over. How long it went on, none of them could afterwards say. Men who were there put it at minutes and swore it was hours. Time in that open turret had come off its hinges. There was only the next tank, and the next, and the fist on the shoulder. But somewhere in it, and no one saw the moment it turned, because there was no moment, only a slow change in the weight of the thing. The valley began to empty of forward motion. The tanks that could still move were no longer coming on. They were turning, nosing back, hulls down, feeling their way in reverse toward the low ground they had come from, dragging their smoke behind them. The gunner put a round after the last of them as it went, and missed, and did not fire again, because the range was opening and the dust was taking them. And, quite suddenly, there was nothing left in his sight worth the shell. He lifted his head from the sight. It was the first time in he did not know how long. The valley below was not a valley anymore. It was a field of standing smoke, and dark, stopped shapes, and small figures moving among them on foot, going away. Here and there a hull still burned with a low, steady flame, sending up a single straight column of black into the windless evening. The guns fell silent, one by one, along the hill, and into the space where the noise had been came a ringing, enormous quiet, the quiet of a room after a door slams. And under it, faint, the ticking of hot metal beginning to cool, and the small sounds of men calling low to one another along the ridge, counting who was still there. He became aware of his body again. His hands would not quite stop shaking. His shirt was soaked through and cold now against his back. His ears sang. His throat was raw from shouting words he did not remember shouting. There was a taste in his mouth like a struck match, and it would not go away for days. Beside him, the commander sat down heavily on the turret floor, the field glasses still hanging from his neck, the blood dried dark down one side of his face. He looked at nothing, and said, "To no one." They turned around. they actually turned around. Because that was the thing that would not fit in their heads. Not that they had held, but that the enemy who had come into the valley certain the way you are, certain the sun will rise, had broken off and gone back the way he came. The men who had been told, only weeks before, that these Americans would run, those men were the ones running now, back down the valley in the falling light, leaving their tanks behind them in the dust. The loader was still holding around. Nobody had called for it. He looked at it in his bleeding hands, as if he did not know how it had got there, and then, carefully, he set it down. The gunner climbed up and sat on the rim of the open turret, the thing that had felt, all morning, like a flaw, a missing roof, a way to die, and let the evening air move over him, and understood, for the first time, what the open top was for. It was for this, for seeing everything, all at once, all around, in the half-second that decided whether you fired first or died. Whoever left that roof off had not forgotten it. They had known exactly what they were doing, and so, it turned out, had the men who had sent him to the top of that hill. Down in the valley, the work of counting began, the way it always does after. Officers walked the ground with notebooks, stepping over the torn earth, putting numbers to what had happened, because numbers are how an army remembers. The numbers were good. They were, in fact, among the best the Americans had yet written down in this whole hard country. But numbers are a poor way to hold an afternoon. They can tell you how many. They never tell you how. The gunner did not care about the numbers. He never would. What he carried out of that valley was not a number. It was the memory of a specific tank, side on in his sight, and the small pressure of his own hand, and the way the earth had thrown itself up around the first German the moment it touched what he and men like him could not see. And it was the waiting, above all the waiting, the long white hours of holding still with his hands off the trigger, while the thing he feared grew in his sight. He would find, in the years after, that the firing faded in his memory, the way loud things do. But the waiting never did. The waiting stayed with him all his life. Because anyone can shoot. It is the oldest thing men do. But to sit in an open steel box on the side of a hill and not shoot, to hold and trust that the holding is the plan, that is a harder and a rarer thing. The enemy had called them broken, had staked a whole morning's confidence on it. And the answer, when it came, had not been a charge or a shout or anything you could put on a poster. It had been men who could wait. That evening, when the light went long and gold across the valley and the smoke leaned over and lay flat, they ran the engine up and backed the machine out of its scrape in the hill, and the brush and the stone fell away from its flanks. And it went down off the high ground on its own tracks, dented, its paint scorched around the muzzle, its floor littered with the brass of the afternoon. An ugly, roofless, half-finished-looking machine that had done exactly the thing it was built to do. No more, and, on this one afternoon, no less. The gunner rode on the top of it because he could not yet stand to be shut inside anything. He watched the hills go by. He did not talk. None of them did. There was nothing yet that could be said. The battalion that held those hills would be remembered. Afterward, in the flat language of reports, the units engaged, the enemy repulsed, the ground held. If you read those pages now, you would never hear the ringing, or taste the struck match, or feel the fist on the shoulder. That is the trouble with the way armies remember. They keep the outcome and lose the hour. They can tell you the 10th Panzer's attack at Guettar was thrown back on the 23rd of March. They cannot tell you what it was to be the man who threw it. It cost them. It always costs. Some of the open machines on that hillside did not come down off it under their own power, and some of the men who had waited through the morning did not ride home on the top of anything. The gunner knew which scrapes in the hill had gone quiet during the firing, and whose they had been, and he did not speak their names aloud, then or later. Some arithmetic a man does only in private, for the rest of his life. But the valley was theirs when the light failed. The road that ran down toward the sea was theirs, and the enemy who had been so sure of them in the morning went to sleep that night a good deal less sure. Word of it traveled, the way these things do, up the chain, into the tents where the maps were, where men who had spent a hard winter being beaten in this country read the flat lines of the report and felt something they had almost forgotten, that they could win. Not because of a wonder weapon. The gun he fired was not magic. It was a good gun, well made, no more. Not because of numbers. They had been outnumbered on that valley floor from the first dust to the last. They had won because someone had thought the thing through beforehand, had gone out in the dark and turned the open ground into a trap, had put the guns where no one would look, had cut the roofs off so the men could see, and had asked those men to do the one hardest thing. Wait. And because the men had done it. That is the whole of it. The plan was only paper, until a frightened man in an open turret kept his hands off the trigger long enough to let it work. The 10th Panzer Division had called the Americans broken. They had said it, and believed it, and built a morning's plan on it, and driven into a quiet valley to prove it. And a line of roofless guns on a bare hill, and the frightened, patient men who sat behind them with their hands off the triggers, had answered, not with a word, but with an afternoon, and the answer stood. He waited, and when the waiting was done, he did his work, and a valley that was supposed to prove the Americans finished proved something else entirely, and then went quiet, and let the smoke lie down, and gave the evening